Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks of human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate them. My guest this time, Jérôme Tagger, is the CEO of an organisation called Preventable Surprises. Of course, with the word surprises in the name, it's more fun if I leave you in a little suspense and let Jérôme explain what it does during the show. As a non-spoiler teaser, his area of expertise involves trying to get people to think differently about some really big issues. Jérôme is also the co-founder and co-host of Breaking the Fever, a podcast and speaker series that I've featured on this show before. He and his co-host Alison Taylor, who's also been on this podcast, invite guests that can help us make a better sense of COVID and its impact on the world. We talk about it in our conversation, and there's a link to that in the show notes. What you're about to hear is some really innovative thinking from someone who is effectively trying to manage large-scale human risk. So please enjoy my conversation with Jérôme Tagger on Preventable Surprises. Jérôme, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
I think it's great to have you, and I love starting things just by getting you to tell my listeners, one, a little bit about you, and then secondly, Preventable Surprises.
Very happy to, and I hope it's not too boring. Look, I'm a French guy living in America, no, I actually have both citizenships, but I'm sort of a multicultural person in that sense. I have been working in the space of sustainable, responsible finance for most of my career. It came from an early interest I had in business school way back in France in the 90s. And I'm not sure if I should call it an interest or a lack of interest. I was generally not interested in what I was learning. I think I was young and immature. I'm not sure that it was the right learning environment for me, although it was a great school. But the one sort of area that I got interested in was the intersection of business and society. How do companies behave? What are their choices and opportunities in terms of ethics? What's the role of governments in regulating or participating in economic decisions? And bear in mind, this is the early 90s, so this is a high time of deregulation and sort of this general direction of things. And I remember having, case study classes, debating whether it was okay for the American government to have intervened to save jobs in the auto industry in the Detroit area in the late 70s, with some people being very gung-ho about it, on both sides. And anyways, that's sort of the one thing that I took out of school, that there was a really real area of interest there. And through sort of trial and error, landed in this emerging, responsible, sustainable finance area in the early aughts, and got stuck there.
And I love that depiction of the societal impact of business, because I think it's very timely at the moment. But if we go way back, to sort of medieval times, every business had a what you might loosely term a social purpose, right? The blacksmith, the baker, all of these people served a purpose. And as we've moved on, we've had lots of sort of shifts away from that. And I think what's really interesting is we're returning to that piece of sort of saying, why should we allow you as a society to operate if you're not delivering something that is good and obviously good for all of us? And I think we can see lots of examples of companies that have gone away from that. And now there's this pushback and saying, we're not going to allow you to trash the environment, to exploit your workers, to exploit customers. And I think this is a really interesting topic. So I'm delighted to be talking to you about it, particularly now where I think it's relevant. So Preventable Surprises that you head up, what is that and what does it seek to do?
Preventable Surprises is a think, do tank. I like to call it an influence tank, but I don't think the term's really caught on just yet. That looks at systemic sustainability issues in the financial system and in asset management in particular. So we look at big picture issues: climate change, biodiversity loss, rising income inequalities. You could go on and on. The COVID crisis is a wonderful, a terrible, but a wonderful illustration of how a systems-wide issue can shake up the financial sector and way beyond that. And what we look at is what are the mechanics and what are the ways and what are the sort of human interventions that are needed in order for the financial system to become more engaged in addressing these systemic issues and to also recognize its responsibility within economic and social and environmental systems. So that's what we do in a nutshell. And I think, our operating universe is largely asset management and what's now called the ESG nexus, or World Environmental Social Governance nexus. Although we don't limit ourselves to what's currently in ESG or what is currently normatively part of ESG, rather we sort of try to push the boundaries of that and always think about, but if you think about investment management as a whole, what is its role and interventions in those systems and in sustainability?
And so you're really looking at financial services, obviously as an industry in itself, but its ability to drive change. And because they control financing for planet, I guess, for simple way of putting it, you've got an ability there to pull levers. And so because you've got huge amounts of investment in companies, the basic idea here being that financial services gets its own act together, but also that it then uses that position to be able to influence companies on the ground. Is that roughly the right way to look at it?
That's absolutely right. And I think that this term of influence through governance levers, the rights and responsibilities that come with partial ownership of companies, or for lenders of capital, these are tremendous sources of power, and it's also fairly concentrated power. So the decisions that a small number of financial services asset management firms make about what about companies, about their expectations from companies on those issues can have tremendous influence.
Right. So for listeners not in financial services, the basic thesis here being is they finance either owning through kind of pension funds or asset management type structures. They own the business or they lend money to them, and therefore you could set the terms for how those businesses behaved, and therefore it's a very powerful way of exerting influence. So if you can get the people within financial services who are taking decisions about voting in simple terms at annual general meetings, who are effectively setting the direction of these companies, you can have a massive societal impact. And that's the lever that you're pulling.
That's right. And, I think one thing that's important in terms of background is to remember that over the past 40 years or so, there's been a shift in emphasis in the role of investors and shareholders in governance. We talk about shareholder primacy, right? And so this is a model that puts investors at the front of the line in terms of the decisions that companies should make. So that in some ways has also increased their sway and their responsibility to those companies. And I think that, that's a question in its own right, and a really important one. What is the balance of powers between investors and companies and governance and civil society and stakeholders, as they're sometimes called, in shaping economic future and in making viable long-term decisions?
And so we're looking really at a pivot away from profit is everything, pure sort of financial return to shareholders, into something much broader that says, how are you responding to societal needs and demands? And Therefore, I almost look at this as a kind of piece that says, well, why do we allow banks and financial services and asset managers to operate if they're not performing a good? And one of the goods that they can perform is to keep everybody else in check, right? If you're controlling that, you have an opportunity to influence. And so I think this is really interesting because it's sort of, as you say, it's using a mechanism that was there that sort of forced the profit motive in years gone by, and you're using exactly that lever to try and drive different objectives and to try and support a different stakeholder set.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I also want to emphasize the complexity of these questions. So it is a balance of power question. It is a governance mechanism question. It's also very much about the safeguarding the financial system in some ways, because when we think about the systemic risk, like climate change, like income inequalities, like the pandemic, and their compound effects over the long term, that's not going to help people who save money. That's not going to help pensioners. That's not going to help the clients of the asset management industry, right? And so that's part of our work there is to bring these considerations, the systemic or frankly sometimes existential considerations, into the realm of thinking in asset management.
And so in essence, actually, it's not as if you're not stepping in and saying, do something that is contrary to your interest, but is the right thing to do. You're actually saying, look, this is the right thing to do, and it will actually deliver you what you're setting out to, which is to protect your stakeholders. So, as you say, pensioners and sort of shareholders of financial services, the way they get the returns that they want on a sustainable basis is if the businesses that they're invested in are looking on a sustainable basis. So you're building in a way, it's a beautiful fusion of the way we look out for everybody's interests is we pursue an agenda that is sustainable.
I would say it's both. It's looking at that overlap, the overlap between societal and environmental interests and the role of the financial services with them. It's also really thinking about the place of finance in society. Is the financial system delivering its goals? Is it successfully helping individuals save money for retirement? Is it successfly allocating capital to the best or the potentially most successful companies? Is it successfully managing risks on behalf of society at large through hedging and insurance and so on? And again, there's no black and white answers here, but there's a lot of messy gray areas. Are people right now in the world happy about their financial retirement prospects? I would say, a lot of people feel that their retirement is at risk, right? And I'm not talking about the wealthier elements of society, right? I'm talking about the middle and working classes, and that's of course for those who actually have access to those services, which is far from universal. Right. Is allocation optimal? Well, that's questionable. You could argue that it's optimal in certain metrics, by the individual metrics of decision making of individual investors, but in the big picture, you take the issue of climate change, the allocation isn't really such a straightforward idea. I mean, the allocation to renewable is limited. The scale and power of passive investment is such that there is a huge risk protection to incumbent businesses, to businesses that have developed around technologies and resources like fossil fuels that are a danger to climate change. And of course we've benefited incredibly, and we continue to benefit incredibly from energy and from fossil energy. So I don't want to ignore that, but also know that the risk of climate change is so big and so urgent that we need to rapidly shift away. And that's that's something where the role of the financial system is so fundamental that it cannot be ignored.
Right. And it's interesting, as you're talking, and I think about it, it sort of occurs to me that on the one hand, you are making sure that we focus on things that we need to focus on. So there are things that as a society, we all know that if we don't sort out equality, if we don't sort out the environment, if we don't sort out the coronavirus properly, that poses existential threats to us as a species. And so we need to kind of do that thing. So you're delivering something. There'll be people that object to issues of those things, but broadly speaking, the average listener to this certainly is going to agree that these things are important. And yet there are obstacles to that. Now, some of those obstacles, as you say, are logistical, which is we are massively tied into fossil fuel. So even if we wanted to switch it off tomorrow, that's going to be hard. We're not going to be able to deliver equality overnight, and we're not going to be able to kill coronavirus off and other threats. But those dynamics are not helped by then the fact that people are resistant to change, and there's a sort of human element to this thing, which is we need to get people accepting the fact that one, they can do something, that that it is desirable for them to do something, to think beyond their own potential, their own self-interest. So there's a human element to this piece, which is why, from a human risk perspective, I think what you're doing is fascinating, because you're basically dealing with the fact that if human beings were able to see the risks that were posed and do everything that they could within their power to solve that, we wouldn't need you to be there. But of course they don't, because we have vested interest, we have willful blindness, we have, genuine fear and an inability to sort of see how to get through this. And so it's very interesting that what you're in effect doing, as I see, is sort of driving people towards different forms of decision making and thereby mitigating human risk.
I think that's right. And I also want to caveat by saying we're not the only ones doing that. So we don't have a monopoly. But we've done... we focus a lot of our theory of change on the role of individuals. And that's in part, pointing out to things like the career risks that people take or choose not to take in calling out issues and, in standing up and saying, hey, maybe the way we're doing things is not optimal or is wrong. Or it's about it could be equally about saying, well, okay, we've established a certain set of norms about how what ESG should be, how ESG and asset management should play out, and so we're going to just apply them because that's what's expected of me. And those are very, very complicated decisions. I mean, first of all, not everybody's like this. And second, we all have this, right? We're all balancing our careers, and particularly, I think so, when we have careers where that sense of purpose is a big dimension, with very practical necessities, putting food on the table, and all of that. And so that risk is not insignificant. On the other side, we've also chosen to emphasize the role of individuals that we call positive mavericks.
I love this. I thought this is really, really interesting concept.
I find it quite exciting to think about and to manipulate. But and you can think about positive mavericks in a variety of ways. But there are people who work constructively towards the change they ambition, that think independently, so don't let themselves be bogged down too much by personal or institutional constraints, by their maybe unconscious biases, that have the capacity to catalyze transformation, have the ability to exert influence, have those soft skills, and are able to take that sort of step back, to think at systems level, and to say, okay, here's how our actions fit into a bigger picture, and don't let themselves be bogged down by the bigger picture, by the concern that, well, we're only a speck in the ocean, and if we don't do X, Y, Z, then, or if we do X, Y, Z, it doesn't really matter because because we're really dependent on the set of actions by a lot of actors that we don't control. But I think the nature of systemic risk is that you just can't limit yourself to that thinking, right? Everybody has a degree of opportunity and responsibility to them. So you can't expect the impetus to just be coming from somewhere else. And it's important to realize and understand where an organization, where a person fits with regards to these big issues and what their levers are.
What I think is really interesting is about, and there's technological explanations for this, but I think it's also just societal, is that individuals can make a massive difference nowadays. So if we take Greta Thunberg and, what she's been able to deliver, we can focus on the lady that was brave enough to film the police officer who had his knee on the guy's neck in Minneapolis. I mean, that takes serious courage to stand there for that period of time filming this thing's going on. But that very small act has driven a whole host of other pieces. So I think there's plenty of, and there's historic precedent around that as well. Rosa Parks would be another good example of it. Individuals can make a massive difference. And what I think is interesting now is that you're sort of taking that dynamic that we've seen historically, but we're seeing more and more of now, and saying, well, let's identify people within companies that can help drive that change, which I guess begs the question of how do you find them and how do you kind of activate them?
That's a great question. I think there's an element of mutual resonance. People speak, we publish things, people publish things, they're active on social media, we're active on social media. There's a human network of people and we connect that way. We sort of see somebody that says something interesting, and so we'll reach out. I've never done so much sort of cold calling, or for that matter, cold emailing or messaging than in this specific job, because whenever I see or hear somebody say something that I find engaging and interesting, I usually just drop them a line. And I learn a lot that way, and hopefully, on occasions also engage these people into our work and into our networks, and that's fundamental. And I think there's a thirst, there's an appetite for community, right? If you're in a position of responsibility in an asset management firm, and your thoughts don't entirely fit the molds that you're in, you're thinking, who can I go to express myself, to test my ideas, to engage with like-minded people? And I think we're looking at this from this systemic lens, but it's true across the board. Anybody that's in a certain community and doesn't entirely fit the norm is going to look for ways to connect to other people who are either like-minded or can be helpful and so on. So that I think there's a very natural dynamic at play here, and we use that.
That's really interesting, because you're absolutely right. If you are trying to, not necessarily you're setting out to be disruptive, but if you have a view that things could be done differently and you want to, then that can be a really lonely place to hang out. And so finding other people, and I was thinking actually, particularly in a regulated industry, you could go to the regulator and sort of say, this isn't quite right, but you'd have to be doing it on the basis of whistleblowing of some sort of something inappropriate, as opposed to steering a strategic direction or an approach to things. And so you really have, it's very difficult. So that's a really interesting function that you provide, which is a sort of just a sort of a friendly ear and a friendly gang to hang out with as people navigate this thing. I think that's a very valuable role to fulfill, because otherwise what typically happens if you're feeling sort of slightly rebellious in a positive sense or disruptive is you either go quiet or you end up leaving the organization. And if you're very lucky, you'll end up like Steve Jobs running the organization. But more often than not, it sort of either gets crushed or you leave. And so this is a very interesting piece around helping those people to see their mission that they may not have even set out to go for, but has just sort of appeared before them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. All work environments, all organizations have normative pressures, and it could just be challenging for people to navigate. And to your point, everything isn't regulated. ethics exists because there's gray areas, right? Because there's ambiguity, because there's complexity, and it's those areas of questioning that people look at, and often, I mean, it's fairly widespread. People look at the world around them. People look at their jobs and think, well, X and Y, Z is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this, or these people shouldn't be doing this. People, have morals and instincts and judgments, and it's not just about values. It's also about this sort of bigger picture type conversations that we're having, and so it's about activating them. It's about creating a trusted space for these people to play a supportive and constructive role.
I think particularly at the moment, this is really interesting, because if we look at coronavirus, that is bringing us all much closer to ethical considerations than we might normally be. And so we look at companies' decision making. Things that are normally just ordinary course of business decisions suddenly start to take on, the ethical lens through which people are looking at how businesses behave now. It's much tighter. Things that might have been acceptable in the past are now looked at through a slightly. So this is we're real shifting sands territory, and it's not just coronavirus that's driving that, but this is a clear example. And I think that's interesting when you talked about regulation is trying to codify this stuff is really difficult. What is behaving appropriately? What's being said? Well, that's moving. And norms are shifting, but also expectations are shifting. And I think that's happening at quite a fast pace. And so sometimes organizations that might try their best to codify things miss that kind of human touch. And so it's interesting when, I come at this from a sort of human risk angle, but actually you're right. It's like, how do you navigate this stuff? Well, you can't program an algorithm to get you through the ethical dilemmas that are there, because it'll come up with the wrong answer. You need people to be helping steer this stuff, and people with a strong sense of what's going on in there, and a willingness to engage, and a willingness to think, and perhaps a willingness to challenge orthodoxy that is not going to come from tried and tested procedures or sort of hierarchical pieces. It's going to come from people with a sort of intrinsic motivation to do it. And so I think what you're talking about is highly prevalent for now.
I mean, I hope so. I hope I hope that what we do is relevant, and it certainly feels that way. All the more, given the complexity of these issues, we go back to talking about climate change, or let's say income inequalities, both very interesting topics in their own rights, with local and global resonance, right? And so you see that they don't get treated universally the same way. They don't get regulated if they do the same way. And so the conversations that you have about income inequalities in the US are not the same that you're having in continental Europe, or in the UK, or in emerging markets for that matter. The conversation you have about climate change are also different, and part of it is, well, what's the societal norm? What's also the corporate capture, and the influence or the ability of regulators to play their role. The sort of standard thing in the U.S. is people are saying, look, Republicans understand that climate change is a big deal, but they're afraid they will lose the next election if they get too supportive because of political money, because of how public opinion is shaped, and so on and so forth. So you have all these very, very difficult dynamics at play, and we just want to sort of hack at them and push the boundaries of thinking around them.
I've got to ask you about the name. Preventable Surprises, because it made me. I love names that make me smile and make me think, and it sort of did both of those. And I sort of was intrigued to what's the genesis, and what's your sort of philosophy behind that.
So I have to caveat that I was not involved with the genesis of it. I only recently, as you know, joined Preventable Surprises six months ago. So I'd have to go back and ask Raj, our founder, or dig into my memory, which isn't that functional anymore. But
Okay, I'll pose the question a different way then. How do you interpret those words? Because I think there's some really interesting choices, because it sort of captures the sort of volatility and unpredictability of the world, and surprises can be good and bad. And so you've got these elements of sort of volatility and unpredictability, and yet with an element of control associated with it. So maybe phrasing the question slightly differently is, how do you see those words, and what does it mean for you?
I mean, to me, they're a very, very practical way of pointing to the obvious. And the obvious is, we look at these systemic issues, we look at these challenges, like climate change, like biodiversity loss, and so on. We know what the challenges are. We know that they can be addressed in different ways. I'm not saying it necessarily in a homogeneous way, but we know ways to address them, and we're not doing it, or we only partially do it. And I use the term "we" loosely as sort of, humanity, but part of the issue is maybe that there's no strong unity of action around this. And so, to me, it's putting the word "preventable" in there is just a reminder that you have agency. We have agency. We can do something about these huge, big challenges. One of our advisors, Michelle Walker, coined the term "gray rhinos" as a sort of antidote to the black swan, which is the thing that you look at after the fact and thought, well, I didn't see that one coming. But the thing about these issues is you see them coming. They're looming. They're big. They're right there. They're in front of you, and you can do something about them. And so that, to me, is really what I find appealing in this name. Is a sense of agency.
Right. And I think that's interesting, because when you look at things that go wrong, and whether that's societally or within organizations, typically there will be someone somewhere that knew something. There's very few things that kind of come so out of the blue that it wasn't in some way, shape, or form predictable. And I think one of the things that's interesting is we don't always, there might be a voice inside our own heads, or it might be a voice within our organization that we just don't listen to because it's too convenient to ignore it. And I find it fascinating when you track kind of societal change. If I take a topic like gay marriage, it's really interesting. There's big fuss about it, and then it gets sort of, it gets legalized here in the UK, and kind of like everybody's moved on. It's kind of like there's a few people that think it's why are we allowing that? But generally speaking, the average of the population is going, yeah, sounds like a sensible idea. Why wouldn't you do that? Let's just do that and move on. And yet it's been this big totemic issue. And I think so. We've got things that sort of, there's an inevitability to them where we kind of close our eyes a little bit, and then they actually turns out they're much easier. But then there's other things where someone somewhere has been, shouting about it, and they just haven't been listened to. And, whether that's about pandemics, whether that's about the environment, whether that's about equality, all of these issues, there are people out there that could, as you say, that could act as an early warning system that could deal with it. And we sort of pretend that, oh my God, I didn't see that coming. I didn't see that social trend coming. I didn't see that change coming. And yet actually, a lot of these things, as you say, are predictable. There's someone that's there. And we have, back to the gay marriage thing, we have the ability to we can just do these things. But we sort of act as our own best enemy in many cases.
It's what I find interesting is so in Greek mythology, you have this character of Cassandra. Yeah. Right. Who plays this role in the I'm not sure how you call it in English, the Troy War, the Trojan Wars, right, and she's the one who's announcing defeat, sort of calling out to others, hey, look, there's trouble coming. And what I find interesting is the negative connotation that this name now has. And I don't know, I'm sure there's millions of things to it. There's probably gender bias and all of that into it. But a Cassandra, when people talk about somebody and say Cassandra, it's not a positive association, right? It's the person that makes you feel uncomfortable.
Right.
It's a person that challenges I guess the immovability of things that you're trying to build around yourself to be able to get on with your life, to manage your psychological balance and sanity. It's the person that tells you that everything is not as sweet and dandy as you're trying to tell yourself. So I'm saying this because it's something we've known for centuries, right? It's anchored in the knowledge of humanity or more than centuries. That's 3,000 years at least. That's it's not a role that humanity has a lot of passion for.
But that's really interesting. I'd never thought of it, but you're absolutely right. Nobody ever uses that name in a kind of, thank God she called that out or he called that out. It's always like, oh God. And the negativity associated massive. But I always reflect on it's a very different example, but it's a similar piece. If you go back to medieval times, you had the kind of court jester, and they were permitted to tell the king or queen, they basically were allowed to criticize, but they had to do it was done in a way that nobody else would be allowed to say those things. And you're allowed to do it because you're being funny, but you're there as a risk management tool, albeit a risk management tool that would be got rid of if you went too far. So it's got limited powers. But you can say things no one else can say, a bit like the person that whispers into the emperor's ear and reminds them that in Roman times that they're mortal. And so we've built these really interesting risk management structures historically, recognizing the human dynamic that you're talking about.
Yep.
And yet, they exist nowadays, but we still aren't making full use of them. And you can see that in the reaction to whistleblowers. It's sort of, it's a hideously negative phrase where we paint this picture of sort of, that's not part. And if I was doing a podcast recently with Catherine Sanderson, who's written a book on the bystander effect. And she said, look, if you look at whistleblowing, people who blow the whistle tend not to be on your team because they're the referee or the umpire, right? So it's a phrase that's endowed with otherism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something very interesting in what you're talking about there, which takes us into the territories of sort of, if we were able to tap everybody's opinions and listen to people, we would be a lot better prepared for some of the things that are coming. And you see it in the movies, right? I'm always struck by the Jeff Goldblum character in movies where he plays the scientist who spots things before everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of eventually we listen to him when it's almost too late, right? And you can, and that seems to be Jeff Goldblum's stock thing. So whether it's Jurassic Park or whether it's Independence Day, it's all the same thing, right? It's just this is the kind of, and he's in the right place.
Right.
He's got the knowledge and he's got the ear of the people that could do something about it, but they choose not to. And I think that's a really interesting sort of thing around. And what you're basically tapping into is that piece that says there will be someone that knows stuff, and hence it's preventable, and hence it's not a surprise, I guess.
Yes, and something that I want to emphasize here is also that in our work, it's not so much or not only about calling out bad behavior or calling out insufficient efforts. It's also about offering solutions, and I think that's a big part of it. Right, and that is an important human dynamic as well, because it participates to bringing people back into a zone of comfort. Right, I don't know. It's like car navigation.
Right.
All right. I find that always a fascinating thing. We didn't grow up with car navigation where I was in France. You had maps and drew your thing, and then maybe somebody at one point said, "Oh, you missed the sign," but that was about it. In America, it's a whole different story. The country is wider. I mean, obviously, there's also a big impact of technology now, and finding your way, navigating around big highways is a complex interaction. You cannot just follow the signs. By the way, there aren't that many signs. So the teamwork becomes a much more important element of going places, and anybody that's been navigating maybe has that experience where they see, well, you can, when you get to a place of uncertainty, of discomfort, because maybe you've missed that turn, maybe you've had a misunderstanding between the navigator and the driver. What you're trying to do very quickly is go back to a place of comfort, because otherwise you're sort of bickering and arguing and all of that. And
I'm not sure what you're talking about, but I've seen it in the movies. Right, clearly, it never happened to me, obviously.
Well, but anybody who at that point can provide a sense of direction or advice, which could be, why don't we just take that exit here and go to the rest stop and look at the map in more detail, or it sounds like the next exit is the next alternative, the next best solution.
Right.
Whatever it is, that's super important. And it's in many ways, in that moment, in that interaction, it's much more important than what the technology says. Because, Google Maps or whatever software you're using will tell you what the next best solution is with a reasonably good error margin. They don't know everything, but there's a lot of data in there. But that's not sufficient. It's not just the fact that the data is there and that it's mapped. It's also that it becomes a big piece of the interaction between the navigator and the driver, and getting them out of the discomfort, right? And so you need to have that functional relationship to get the car somewhere and to get the people in the car somewhere in a good state of mind. So I'm venturing off in a completely different direction.
Love it, though. Love it.
But I think it's crucial to recognize that, right? To think about how the interpersonal dynamic plays into achieving goals, and how much providing a solution or ideas and sort of the positive energy that comes with it is important.
And I think that there's a really interesting point there, right? Because there's this reliance. There's lots of interesting points, but the one that sort of strikes me is, if we look at a world where we've got more data than ever before, and sort of more knowledge and more science and more expertise, and there's a whole load more things that ought to lead to better decision making, and yet we hear this ultimate point, which is people are the ones that take decisions, and so we need to deal with that human dynamic of how can I change my mind. And how can I get other people to change? And how do we make that permissible? Because if somebody's decided the world is flat, then you can present them with a ton of evidence, but they won't believe it until they, sort of see it and you need to find ways to because it becomes an emotional thing around having to ditch things you thought before. Yep. And I think it's really interesting in a polarized world where there is suddenly, a lot of people are expected to suddenly change their mind on things when actually that's quite hard. And we all struggle with this to a certain extent because we're not programmed to question ourselves, because it's not necessarily beneficial from an evolutionary perspective. But I think there's something interesting in what you say. And I love the analogy of the driver and the navigator having an argument about whose fault it is, because the navigator will have pointed it out and the driver won't have. They'll both would likely blame the person. But ultimately, how do you get back from where you've got to? And I think that's a really interesting piece around thinking about the human dynamics of how you help people change their mind. How do we do that? Because you can't just do that with raw facts and data. You have to work on the emotional side as well. And we see that, I think, in a polarized world, and particularly where there's pressure on people, if they've decided to go down a particular route, getting them to unwind that position without it being embarrassing and feel awkward is really important.
And so there's an author that I'm a huge fan of, Kwame Anthony Appiah. I try to invite him on our podcast. He hasn't responded yet. So, Mr. Appiah, if you listen to this, please join.
We have a lot of reach on this podcast. I don't know if it goes that far, but let's find out.
So he's a philosopher, ethicist, and wrote a wonderful book a decade ago called The Honor Code: How Moral Revolutions Happen. Which I keep going back to and probably still struggling to understand, but nevertheless always happily and highly recommend, because it explores some of the social dynamics of those moral transformations, whether it's the end of dueling or foot binding or slavery or and so on and so forth, and looks at the commonalities of how society has evolved and the sort of influence mechanics that suddenly make that change possible. You talked about gay marriage earlier, and I think that's a great illustration of this as well. And his overarching point, or one of his overarching points, is the role of honor in this. So not just pride, slightly different, but honor as what is the honorable thing to do as a member of society, and how that becomes an inflection point. So I think it's an important notion also to think about in all these challenges. How do you make people feel like they are on the right side of history, or on the right side of behavioral moral dilemma, and are doing the honorable thing.
Right, and that's a really tough thing, because the answer sure as hell isn't telling them they're wrong, because no one wants to hear that.
Well, nobody wants to, but I think also we're always, although we talk a lot about bubbles at the moment, we're always confronted with a variety of opinions and forces, right? Or maybe that's a privilege, but I think many of us are. With different degrees of nuance, right? I mean, if you look at elections in countries that benefit from elections, although there is a lot of things, so what do you call it? It's the antagonism and radicalization and all of that. Well, you look at candidates and influential people, and you still have variety and diversity of opinions and perspectives. And some people will tell you that you're radically wrong, and some people will tell you that you're gently wrong, or right, or the other way. I mean, you have all these nuances at play, and they're all a part of it. So I don't think there's like just one way to change opinions and to change mindsets and to change understanding and dynamics. I just think there's a variety of forces at play, social dynamics.
And I think the tools that we can use are changing as well, right? And there are, as sort of social norms shift and different voices get heard. So there's something in the UK called the Overton window, which is this, maybe it's not just a UK thing, it's this idea of what's acceptable political debate. And if you have extreme candidates, they can pull that window and so normalize either very good or very bad, depending on your perspective, things from happening and being in the sort of political norm. And I think there's some interesting things happening there from a social and societal perspective as well. Stuff we're talking about, that men having feelings is a good example, I think, of where this macho, just get over with it, actually has caused major mental health issues for a number of men. Just to pick a particularly oppressed end of the species. But it's fascinating. I think that these things are changing, and therefore if one can respond to that, as you say, I think it demonstrates that the way that window shifts demonstrates that things can move.
Absolutely. No, I was going to emphasize that and also think about how that Overton window in different countries in different ways has been influenced by radical opinions that were not in power for decades. When you think about Brexit, for example, when you think about the National Front in France, for example, you just have a variety of examples of vocal forces in politics and as you said, in other areas that are in a decision of power, but suddenly are able to set the terms of the debate.
Right. That's very interesting. Yeah, it's true, actually. And that's interesting. Back to your, looking at changing decision-making within organizations.
Yep.
You don't necessarily need to be the senior leader to be able to affect change.
That's right. Absolutely. And I mean, I think it depends on the organizations as well, of course. And I mean, the quality of leadership and the culture are fundamental. I think we've all had different experiences, and sometimes you work with teams and cultures where things are very rigid and it's hard to have an influence if you're not at the top, or the other way around. You have environments that are sort of more striving in that sense, and where the cursor between control and trust is set in different ways, and that enable and facilitate that sort of influence in different ways. So it's all humans at the end. I'm not saying that there's a in its all situations. I'm not advocating for a particular model of management here. That's not necessarily my expertise, but my experience is that bringing a diversity of opinions and points of views and listening is usually a good way to yield positive results.
I agree. Which is why people listen to this podcast, Jérôme. At least I like to think anyway. So, and look, as we sort of survey the scenes, and I've already introduced the listeners to Breaking the Fever. We'll do a plug for that right at the end to make sure people don't forget as our kind of closeout piece. I mean, that's one aspect of what you're looking at. But what are you sort of seeing as the challenges that we're facing? What are you grappling with at the moment? And what's next on your radar?
Well, those are some big questions. So, first of all, thank you for supporting Breaking the Fever. Sorry, I have a visitor. I think there's a degree of reckoning that's happening, and that's ahead of us. People hope that we come out of this COVID crisis and as fast as possible. I certainly hope so. It's the economic and social devastation is extremely strong. It's strong here in the U.S. It's unseen since the Great Depression, but it's there. It's there. It's costing capital. Climate change is there. People think about climate change as a thing of the future, but it's a thing that's happening now. We always talk about how temperature will rise. We should put the emphasis more on the fact that May was just the hottest month on record in history of humanity, and so on. So when I think about what's ahead of us, I think about urgency. First of all, we don't have the opportunity of time. There's a number of decisions that are being made now. There will be made in the next few months, and in the next 2 or 3 years, that will have radical influence on humanity for the foreseeable future and for the long term. And those might be infrastructure investments in the form of, capital expenditure in energy. They can be social capital investments. They can be investments in social infrastructure. I'm really curious to see how the healthcare system in the U.S., particularly where it's so fragile, for lack of a better term, will come out on the other side of this. These big transformations, biodiversity loss, we haven't really talked about, but is also a huge piece of this that is entering people's consciousness. They need to be addressed. There is no alternative, and so my focus, if anything, is on this. It is on pushing to accelerate transformation, pushing to do so meaningfully, with the best understanding of science and of economic and social dynamics, in a way that really preserves all the achievements of humanity and makes so inclusively.
Wow. I love that depiction, and it was, I thought it was very, very rich in terms of the timescale that we need to do things in. That is sort of shortening. We've got ever bigger bits of history that we're dealing with. So climate change isn't something that's just happened. The equality piece isn't something that's just sort of, inequality, it's been around for ages. And so we've got these fundamental things that are all tumbling around at the same time that we need to deal with urgently. And I think that idea of reckoning is very powerful because it illustrates the scale of the challenge, which is, this has been long festering. So we kind of ought to have done something about it, and we haven't, and we need to move very, very quickly on all of these issues. And we haven't necessarily got the structures in place to be able to do that. And so we're going to have to pivot very, very quickly and interestingly. And I think that's a great way to look at it because it captures the sense of urgency, but also I think the sense of, excitement and that we're on the cusp of something very different. And I'm hoping that very different thing is a better outcome rather than a continued decline. But who knows?
I share your hope. And make it an ambition. And I think part of the opportunity here is, for in the universe that I work in is for people to revisit the role of their institutions, of their organizations in society. And, we're at this moment, we're sort of very fixated on politics. We've got a big election here later this year, as you know. You had one recently. There's a number of things that are happening on politics where it always feels like, well, it hinges on the next political bifurcation. What's going to happen next? And that's probably true. I also want to emphasize that it is not the only factor, right? And that this agency that we've talked about today is something that's important for people in positions, in decision-making positions, in financial services and asset management, in companies, in civil society, to keep in mind and to activate.
I love that. We needed something positive to finish on, right? And you have just provided it. And I was thinking, actually, as you were talking, of course you believe that, because you wouldn't be doing your job and you wouldn't be in that post if you didn't think there was the capability of changing and delivering on these things. And so it's that sense of positivity that's there. And I love the sense of the agency piece, which is sort of, we can all sit there and feel like passengers on this pick your vehicle that's hurtling towards the oblivion. But actually, there are things that we can all do. And I think that's a beautiful, positive sense there. And one of the things that we can do is listen to Breaking the Fever, which is Jérôme's series with Alison Taylor, which I've put on a previous podcast and we'll link to in these show notes. But it's a thoroughly excellent series of really interesting, eclectic mix of speakers and discussions that I think certainly has helped me begin to make sense of some of the things. I mean, it's caused me to think about a whole load of other things I hadn't thought of before, but that's a great positive. So that I think is a beautiful manifestation of your positivity, which is if we think creatively intelligent, get more people in the room and listen a bit more and take action ourselves, we can do something. So I think you've left us with a wonderful positive note. Jérôme, thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for the Breaking the Fever piece. And above all, thank you for being such a great guest on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Christian, for having me, and thank you for steering the conversation in such a masterful way.
So that's it for another episode. My huge thanks to Jérôme for appearing and to you for listening. For links to Preventable Surprises and Breaking the Fever, take a look in the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all the platforms. Any listeners that haven't yet managed to leave a review for the show, if you can, it really does help to get 5-star reviews. It allows other people to find the show and me to continue to attract high-quality guests. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back with another episode very soon. In the meantime, if you want more Human Risk content, do check out the Human Risk newsletter and the Human Risk Twitter account, both of which feature regular human risk-related content. Links to both of those in the show notes. Stay safe, and thanks again for listening.